This lesson is on the Sui and Tang Dynasties of China, and this is part one of a six-part series on East Asia in the post-classical period. Now first let's do a quick review of the fall of the Han Dynasty. It's been a while since we've looked at East Asia and China specifically, and so let's kind of reload here. So in 220 CE, the Han Dynasty falls due to a combination of internal corruption in the government, weak emperors who had strong concubines, wives, and eunuchs often running the government and controlling the emperor, and then the ever-present threats from northern nomads and barbarians. And so after the Han Dynasty collapsed, this left a power vacuum in China. This breakup into warring states, much smaller local kingdoms and warlords. And in many ways, this was similar to Europe's Dark Ages, but much shorter and less intense because China had been through all of this before. They had this history of the Dynastic Cycle, right? That a dynasty loses the mandate of heaven, collapses, a period of warring states, and then a new state will emerge and control everything. And so China had that longer history to draw on, plus their fundamental culture and political organization really wasn't all that damaged, as opposed to Europe, which had not a very strong history of organization and political structure before the Romans. Once the Romans left, Europe really had nothing to draw on. And that's part of why Europe's Dark Ages were much longer. But eventually a group did emerge, and this was the Sui. So about 350, 360 years later, the northern Zhou Empire, and that's the light blue area here, kind of the central belt of the old Han Dynasty, united with some of the northern nomads up in here, and then set about conquering the northern kingdoms and uniting all of eastern Han lands through warfare into this newer dynasty. And this new dynasty was much more centralized, much more top-heavy, right? There was less emphasis on the Shi, right, the scholar Gentry class, and much more emphasis on a central government in control of everything. Right, so in 589, Wen Di, who was the emperor of Zhou, conquered the state of Chen and reunited China completely, right? And he lowered taxes and emphasized grain storage and famine relief through taxation. Again, this is a much more centralized government that's very interested in poverty relief and taking care of the people and kind of turning outwards back towards the peasantry, as opposed to what the Han had been at the end of their dynasty, which was just turn inwards on the government and have a good time, I guess. But Wen Di's son Yang Di murdered him to gain the throne, and started pushing back against the northern nomads and saying, pushing them out because they were really no longer needed. It was a political alliance that helped the Sui, gain control of China, but afterwards, they had no use for them. Remember, the Chinese always looked at the northern nomads as, barbarians, as backwards people, really didn't want to have much to do with them. I mean, the Sui needed nomadic help to conquer during that, Middle States period, but, once their usefulness was done, the barbarians had to go. And Sui Yangdi took a very, traditional Han approach to government, right? He reinstituted the Confucian education and exams. He was a great builder of palaces. He moved the capital city to Luoyang and, really tried to return China to its Han glory. And like the Han, he was also an expansionist, right? He attacked the Korean kingdoms repeatedly between 611 and 614, and this didn't really work very well for him. The Sui had limited control over the Koreans, as we're going to see in our upcoming lesson. It wouldn't be until the later Tang Dynasty that China took control of the Koreas. And he angered his subjects through excessive taxation and failed wars, right? You can raise your subjects' taxes and go win wars, or you can have peace and keep taxes low. But if you raise taxes and then lose, you're done for as a politician. That's always been true. It always will be true. And then Turkic tribal invasions to the north and west prompted widespread results. And so Yang Di was assassinated by his ministers in 618. And this really marked the end of the very short Sui dynasty. And, predictably, there's a little bit of a rocky period, but this one was very short, right? Only about 9 years when Li Yuan, who was one of Yangdi's generals and officials, took the throne. And Li Yuan was mixed Chinese nomad ancestry, and this was starting to become more common in northern China for the nomads and the ethnic Chinese to be mixing. But Li Yuan founded the Tang Dynasty in 623. And Li Yuan's armies were very expansionist. In fact, the Tang were expansionist throughout their time on the dragon throne in the Middle Kingdom, right? The Tang armies conquered westward into the Turkic highlands. Remember, there's very hot, broad desert here, and then you're starting to get into the Himalayas and the Tibetan plateau. But so they pushed outwards into what we sometimes call Turkestan, or the Central Asian steppes or the plains, and conquered this whole big area here. And because of that, he was able to develop military units comprised of these Turks, who, as you know, are very fierce horse-mounted archers, very fast, very tough. I mean, these are the ancestors of the Mongols and the descendants of the Hun and the Xiongnu. And so very often these Turkic military units were some of the best trained units that the Tang had, and they helped in many, many ways. They helped allow the Tang to conquer southwards and westwards into the Tibetan areas, also northwards here into Manchuria, and finally, to take over Korea itself. In fact, by the height of its expansion, the Tang, lands were bigger than the Han lands, and the Tang were a very successful dynasty because of this. And so, as Chinese emperors often did, the Tang moved the capital to Chang'an, and they redeveloped the bureaucracy and extended the examination system, granting more passing marks and extending the bureaucracy to try to really get more people to buy into the Tang government and to give them more political legitimacy. And these exams, as you recall, led to wealth and power within any Chinese dynasty, and it was a key part of social mobility within any Chinese dynasty, and the Tang were no different. And also under the Tang, imperial academies were created to train the sons of rich families for the exam. So a real explosion in the scholar gentry class under the Tang. It was also at this time period that Buddhism became a major religion in China, right? I mean, the Han had pushed Confucianism, and that was the state religion, but the nomadic people to the north and south and the Tibetans were strongly Buddhist, and they introduced a lot of Buddhism to China. And the Sui and the Tang revived Confucianism for its bureaucratic and educational values, but the Tang nobles and rulers themselves were often Buddhist. So we get this interesting mix where the state religion doesn't match the religion of the rulers, because privately the Tang believed in Buddhism and followed that tradition, but they also understood that Confucianism gave a lot of power to the government and to the people in charge, and so they were willing to use Confucianism as a tool of political legitimacy in the same way the Han had. And this created religious tensions within China, right? Because Buddhism was a foreign religion, and the Confucians and Taoists saw themselves as the followers of the true Chinese religion. I mean, those were the indigenous native religions that had sprung up in China, as opposed to Buddhism, which, as you know, is an Indian religion. This also created taxation problems for the Tang government, because Buddhist lands and monasteries were not taxed. Anytime a new one opened up, that was less land and buildings bringing taxes into the government. And the Confucians held a lot of power in the government. I mean, you had to be a Confucian, or at least very knowledgeable about Confucianism, to get a job in the government. And so Buddhism is pulling away, government wealth and power at the same time that Confucianism is how these people get their jobs. And so by the 840s, there starts to be this change in the Tang government. And so by the 840s, these emperors are openly hostile to Buddhism and began to close and destroy many Buddhist monasteries and temples. And Confucianism was back as the state religion of China, whether this had to do with belief or tax policy and the wealth and power of the government, I don't know. Right? But beginning in the 740s, the Tang royal house started to fall apart, right? The Emperor Xuanzang became infatuated with a concubine by the name of Yang Guifei, and she manipulated the older emperor. He was older and had wives. She was young and beautiful and very intelligent and very politically astute. And she started, to get her relatives jobs in the government. And as her, the number of her relatives in the government grew, the level of her power grew, and it became clear that Yang Guifei was actually in charge of the Chinese Empire at this point. And as he became older and more infatuated with this beautiful and deceptive concubine, Xuanzang started to neglect government and infrastructure projects, things like bridges and canals and roads, and the tax base was dropping and the military became weakened. And as always, here come the nomads from the north. And so it really became clear that the local governors were the independent rulers of China. We get a return to warlordism. And this is what happens when feudal states break apart. And so the dynastic cycle turns once again. And so that's it. Thanks for watching.